Hi, Dave Scotland for 3D Artist, and welcome to another tutorial. Today we're going to take our simple character from the previous issue and we're going to put him through a very basic walk cycle. Now the premise that I'm operating under for this tutorial is not a great deal of creativity or wow factor, but mainly the basics. I really want to teach you the process to use when animating. So this doesn't necessarily mean it has to be for a walk cycle. It can be for any animation that you choose to do. You will have to follow a specific process, and what we're going to cover today is the process that is used by most animators in the industry and the procedural steps that we go through to achieve the final animation. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is set up our reference, and you should never attempt to animate anything without reference. To think that you can animate something from your memory is the number one mistake that people make when they try to animate. So I'm going to show you how to set up some reference so that it's nice and usable in a 3D environment. So what I've got here in After Effects is just a fairly standard walk, and I've deliberately used a CG element so it's a lot clearer to see the various poses. It's slightly stylistic, but it's realistic enough for our purposes to be able to get our robot to move in a fairly realistic way. So what you're seeing here is a walk cycle that is across the stage. So it's a full moving walk cycle, and I wanted to show you this just in case you get your hands on some reference source that is also moving across the stage. The alternative, if I just show you, this one is actually moving on the spot. Now this is what we require to do a walk cycle in 3D Max. We need the reference to be non-translating, or to have it moving on the spot as if the character was walking on a treadmill. And the best walk cycle reference is in fact a person walking on a treadmill, because it's much easier to animate the character when they're in a static position in 3D. So what I'm going to do is quickly show you how to get to this stage here based on a full transitioning walk cycle, and it's actually a lot easier than you think. So I'm just going to create a new comp, just going to drag my sequence down onto a new composition button, and you can see here that we've got our full composition length and we've got way more frames than we really need, so we need to work out exactly the frames we do need. And here is the contact point here. You can see that the heel is on the ground, the toe is on the ground here. The hands are opposing one another, blue hand back, green hand forward, and then the walk cycle starts pretty much from there. As far as traditional walk cycle poses go, this is the contact pose, and it pretty much is the start for the one that we're about to do now. Now what I need to do is find the exact same pose further down the animation, which is here. So I'm going to come to that frame, and then I'm going to drag up my range for that layer, and I'm just going to leave that. But if I go one more frame over, you'll see that it disappears, and that's what I want to do. Now I'll come back to the previous one, which is here, and do the same from the start. Just drag it up. Then I'm going to drag the whole thing back to the start frame, and then I'm going to drag my work area to just encompass this area, and I can actually use a little shortcut. We can right click and we can trim comp to work area, and that trims our comp perfectly to contain just that single walk cycle. So one left and right leg cycle ending back exactly where we started. And it's very important that your reference always contain the first and last frame should be identical. For any cycle work, this is absolutely crucial. You must have the first and last frame absolutely matching. So the next thing we've got to do is we've got to try to keep this guy in the same spot. So what I'm going to do is go into my view menu. I'm going to pull up show rulers just so that I can click over here on the ruler and drag out a guide. It's pretty much the same as you would in Photoshop. I'm just going to position it roughly in the middle, and then I'm going to bring up my position transform for the layer, and I'm going to click on the position stopwatch to activate animation. You can see there's a little keyframe that's been created here at frame 0. And what I'm going to do is slide this across. Now if I hold down shift, I can actually lock it from moving up and down. And I'm going to try to line it up, and I've found a very good place to look is the base of the neck. Even though the head may tilt forward slightly throughout the walk cycle, the base of the neck tends to stay right down the center line. So that one's looking pretty good. And then the idea here is to get away with as few keyframes as possible. Now you'll find that if this is a human character, a real person walking across, you will need to use a few more keyframes. I'm just simply going to go all the way to the end and do the same method, holding shift while I drag, and just line up that center of the neck again. And you'll see that now we have a walk cycle that transitions on the spot. And as I said, if it's a human character, you may have to come through and actually move these around, but try to always keep the center of gravity, which is the center of the pelvis, perfectly lined up with that line. And you'll find that there's not many walk cycles when filmed from side on that don't work in this way. So you will notice a very slight pause in the cycle here, and that's because the first and last frame are identical, and we need that for our animation. That's going to become a lot more apparent when we get into 3D Studio Max. So let me just show you the reference we're going to be using for our main animation. So I've got this side on the spot reference, I've got this front on the spot reference, and I'm going to select both of them and I'm going to drag them down onto a new composition. I don't want to sequence the layers, and what that does is creates a composition with the perfect length, and we just need to change the composition settings to reflect a wider composition. So I'm going to untick this, and I think I'll go for something like a 720 by 405 HD widescreen aspect ratio. 24 frames per second is very important, and for your information, everything we're going to be doing in this tutorial is going to be at 24 frames per second. It just makes the process a lot easier having a number that's so divisible by even segments, as opposed to 25 or 30 or 29.976. It becomes very difficult to manage. So everything looks good. I'm going to go OK to that. I'm going to grab both of these, right click, transform, and fit to height, and that's just going to nicely snap without doing any stretching or squashing. I'm going to grab the front and I'm going to move that off to the right hand side, and I'm going to grab the side and I'm going to move that off to the left hand side, and what you'll be left with is this, which is a nice left and front walk cycle. And the only thing we need to do now is to add some time code. Now this is very important. It's reference time code that allows you to reference the specific frame you're on at any time while you're in 3D Studio Max. And it just, to have it in your reference, to have it in your viewport is a very handy thing. So I'm just going to go layer, new, and solid. I'll just make it black. Doesn't really matter about the color. We'll call this time code. Go OK, and to that I'm going to add, so if you highlight the layer, I'm just going to add an effect of text timecode, and I can pull the little target up into the perfect corner up in the left hand side here. You can always just, in the text position here, you could always just type in 0 and 0, and that will put it right smack in the corner. I'm also going to reduce the number a little bit, and make sure you tick composite on original, untick it so that it plays over the top, and you will see that if I just isolate this, there's a little black box. Just tick the show box to get rid of it, and then we have our time code. At the moment it's set to hours, minutes and seconds. Just in the display format, change that to keyframes, and that's going to give us some nice time code. And if you've done this correctly, that'll say 14, and this down here says 14 in the keyframes as well, and those numbers should always match, 23, 23. If they don't, it means that your frames per second have been set incorrectly for your compositions or your footage sequence. So that one looks okay, so we're just going to duplicate that, Control D, so we've got two time codes now, and just on the second one, I'm going to slide the first number over to the left hand side. Probably about there is going to do us, and then I'm going to tick composite on original as opposed to the first one which has it unticked. And now we have two time codes in the window. Very easy to see what the actual frame is for this particular pose or this particular pose. So now all we need to do is to render this out. So if I go composition, add to render queue, kicks up my render queue here. Go into your lossless settings, and we're going to set this as a, let's go TGA sequence, and everything looks fine here. If I go OK, just give it an output. Create yourself a folder, and this will be, say, walk cycle ref double. Whoop. And we'll go 24 FPS. Just select that, Control C to copy, double click so that you're in that folder, and that way these files will be created in that folder. And then just paste that name there and go save. And After Effects adds the sequential number hashes here, and that's all good, and click render. So the next thing we need to do is just bring this into 3D Studio Max. Okay, so here we are in 3D Studio Max, and before we get started setting up the scene for our walk cycle, what I wanted to show you is this is the character that we rigged in the previous issue, and it's our simple robot character here, and basically we rigged this character for an FK system. Now that means that it's forward kinematics, and in order to pose this character, we just select the control objects, the rig control objects, like say for instance the hip here. We could rotate this up, we could rotate the knee down, we could point the toes to the ground, we could even bring the toe up slightly, we could bend the spine, and everything is based on a forward system. So if I wanted to move the foot forward, I would have to rotate at the knee and then slightly move here. If I wanted to move out to the side, I'd have to rotate from the hip. If I wanted to straighten the leg, it would be from the knee and making sure that the hip was pointing in the right direction. So now that's a fairly old school way of doing things. It's been with us for a long time, the FK system, the forward kinematic system. But in 3D, we actually have the ability to use a slightly different system that is a little bit more intuitive when it comes to animating, called inverse kinematics, or IK. And what I've actually done is taken this character, I've quickly done a few IK controllers, and what we're going to do is use those IK controllers to create this walk cycle. But having said that, if you have created this rig based on the previous issue, then you can certainly follow this process that I'm about to show you for the walk cycle using your FK rig. You don't have to use the IK rig, but I wanted to show you an alternative so that you can walk away with the ability to do both after this tutorial. So let me just show you what the IK rig looks like and how some of the subtle differences are in the rig. So this is the IK rig, and it's exactly the same in many ways with the exception of the feet and the hands. Notice the feet have a new controller. Here it is down here, and all you do is simply highlight the controller and you can move it up, forward, and notice if I move it up, the knee bends automatically and the ankle foot keeps pointing forward. Now that's basically how IK works. I can move it up, I can move it across, and all of these joints actually work the way they should. I've wired the control into the joints so that they work the correct way. I've restricted them from rotating on axes that they shouldn't be rotating on. You may notice these little helpers out here. These are for the knee, and if I point this up here and then grab this helper and move it, you'll see that wherever I move it to, the knee will point at it, and the elbows are the same. Now the hands have a new controller, and if I bend that, if I move that controller in, you can see the arm is bending exactly the way it should. So I could move that in, I could move it down, and you can see that I'm getting some very nice organic type motion, albeit restricted the way the joints should be restricted. Like the elbow will only rotate on the axis it should, and it also has an elbow helper which is out behind the elbow here. Be careful where you put these. If they are too close to the character, you can get some funny residual animation, and try not to ever bring them in front of the character because you'll get some very unwanted movement there. Just undo those moves, put our character back to its starting position. As for the rest of the character, it's exactly the way it was before. I've got my pelvis controller, which is my center of gravity. I've got my rotation for the hips, which operate a little bit differently. Because I've got IK, the feet always will stick to where the IK helpers are, the two feet controllers, and that way I can actually get some very nice movement in the hips, and the whole hip or the whole leg won't start rotating with those hips, which is exactly what we want. I've got some upper upper body control the same as our FK rig. Now, watch what happens when I rotate too far. I can actually break the hand off the joint. So as we animate, we have to be cautious to not move this IK controller beyond the arm. The first thing that happens is we break the arm. But if I go too far, you may not see the break, but unfortunately the arm is going to cease to actually rotate. Notice my elbow controller really just twists the arm and doesn't change the bend or orient the bend. So as we move forward, I'll probably mention that again. Be very careful not to break the IK by moving the controllers out beyond the hand. I've got my head controller here, and of course hidden in here is the neck controller, which really doesn't do too much. So that's basically it. Some very subtle changes, and then down the bottom here, obviously I've got my master character controller, and this is what we're going to use later on to do our full 10-second walk cycle. So let's get started and set our 3D Max scene up. First thing I want to do is make sure that everything is organized the way it should be, and if I go into my layer manager, I've taken the time to really do that. You can see here I've got my fingers in a couple of layers of their own, so everything relating to the left and right hand fingers here on their own. I've got my mesh, which I can freeze and unfreeze. At the moment it's frozen, which means I can't accidentally grab any of the mesh, which is good. I've got my mesh smooth toggle, which toggles mesh smooth on and off, and for this walk cycle we're going to toggle it off. So I'm just going to go into the modifier for that little mesh smooth toggle and go into the mesh smooth and just switch the little light bulb icon. Ooh, there we go. So now the timeline is going to be a lot more usable. There's going to be a lot less lag through the process because every piece of geometry doesn't have this mesh smooth switched on. I've also got my rig to hide. Now these are all of the objects. If I unhide them, these are all the objects that go into the rig that don't require selecting. So there's some dummy objects, there's some IK controllers, things like that. So I've got rig to hide labeled here, and if you just hide those, you won't need to touch those. And then I've got rig objects, and these are all your controller objects that we're going to animate, and later on we can hide those to do our final render. So that's looking good. The next thing we need to do is make sure we've got enough frames on the timeline. Now I've already got 24 here, but what I'll get you to do is click on the time configuration button down the bottom there. Make sure we're in film, or you can click on custom and type in 24. To really make sure that it's 24, custom is probably a better way to go. In some software packages, film is not considered 24, but 23.976. So let's go custom with a pure 24, and that's going to work nicely for us. Everything else should be fine, except for the length. You'll probably have to set your length to 24 frames. So it should be 24 frames per second, and 24 is the length, which is a frame count of 25, and I'll explain why now, if I go okay to that. The 25th frame is 0, because I've set this to a length of 24. In any 3D application process, the timeline still counts frame 0 as a frame, and that's why we have 25 frames on the timeline down the bottom here. So your very last frame should be 24, first frame 0. So the time is set up correctly, and everything else I think is looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and set up our reference. So I'm just going to jump into a left view here, and I'm going to create a plane just in the geometry section here. It doesn't really matter about the size, because we're going to type in the amounts right here. Now remember, we rendered our reference at 720/405. So what I'm going to do is type in the width at 720. I'm going to type in the length as 405, and that should give you a plane. Even though it's a little bit big at the moment, it's exactly the right aspect ratio for our reference, which means there won't be any squashing or stretching at this stage, which is good. We can do that to fit our character shortly, but we want to maintain the aspect ratio correctly. So the other thing I'm going to do is set the length segments. I can go into the modify tab now that it's been created and select the length segments to 1, width segments to 1. And that just means if I'm in a wireframe mode, I'm not going to get the lengths, the segments all visible, and I'm going to be able to see my reference nice and easily. Bring up your material editor. I'm just using the M key. Here's my new swatch. I'm going to give it a new name. This is my ref, and I'm going to click on the diffuse button, which opens up the map browser, and I'm going to open up the maps and go to bitmap, and I'm going to navigate to that walk reference, and I'm going to select the first file, the TGA file, and make sure that sequence is ticked and go OK. It will prompt you to create an image file list control. Just go include image path and go OK. So what we're looking at here, if I change this to just a box display, this is our reference, and because it was a sequence, it will actually animate as reference. So now what we can do is drag that onto our plane and tick the show shaded material in viewport, and now we have our material visible in the viewport. I'm going to use the scale button, and I'm going to make sure that I'm positioning my mouse right in the center of the gizmo here, so that as I scale it, it is uniform, as opposed to this or this. I want to uniformly scale it, and I want to move it across. Now, something that can make life a little bit easier for you is to jump into the hierarchy tab, effect pivot only, and this allows me to just change the position of my pivot point. And I'm going to move it right to the center of my character and place it right on the ground. And that way, as I scale it, that's the point that it's going to scale from. Now come out of that effect pivot only button. And now as I scale it, it's going to scale from there. So if I move this over and stick it in line with my character, so that's looking pretty good. Something like that. So it's lined up with the feet of the character. Now as I scale it, it's going to scale around that character and I won't have to scale, move all the time. So what I want to do is go to a frame where the walk is not too high, something like frame 6, with 3 being the lowest part of the walk cycle, 9 being the highest. Let's go to 6. Now we can scale it, and the head height becomes pretty accurate for us. So I'm just moving that. I'm just going to slide this forward slightly just so that we can see what's happening. And the pelvis should work for us. Remember that there's bend in the knee here that's a little bit more than our character, which will drop the pelvis ever so slightly down to here. The head looks like it's slightly bigger, so I can scale it just a little bit more. That's looking pretty good. And I think that's probably going to be okay for what we need. So the next thing I do is just pull it back and line it up with my character. Remember, the neck is important. That's that center line that I was talking about. So that's looking pretty good. Now you'll notice we can't really see what's going on in the character in the reference, because the character covers the reference. So let's come around to a perspective view to really see what's going on here. The other thing is that plane, because we created it in a left view, is cutting our character in half. Now we can pull this back and out of the road, and as long as we're looking in a left view, which is the hotkey L, it's all going to work perfectly. There's no perspective in a left, top, front, side view, only in a perspective view or an orthographic view. Now, this is what I mean by that. I'm going to take this and move it right back here. Now, if I'm in a left view, it doesn't matter. It's still going to be the right size. But if I'm in a perspective view, hit P, and all of a sudden now those sizes are wrong. So hit L for left view. You can see up here, it's my left view, and that works perfectly. In fact, I'll move this back over a little closer. Just makes it a little easier to grab later on. So something like that should do us. Go to that left view. Now here's a little trick that I learnt just to get rid of the, in the side view, I don't need this front view over here. So what I'm going to do is put an edit poly modifier in the modifier stack. You can see it here, which doesn't do anything. And then on top of that, I'm going to use a UVW map. Now, if I go down to the edit poly modifier now and make sure that the show end result button is ticked, then I can use my vertex selection, grab the 2 vertex on the left, sorry, and drag it across. Now notice the image doesn't change at all, but if I didn't have this ticked, you'll see that it will actually squash the image. What I'm doing is I'm changing the size of the plane, but the UVW above it keeps the image or the texture exactly in the right space. So switch that back on, move this back over, and so now I have some nice left view reference without the front being visible. And that's exactly what I want. Now what I'm going to do is duplicate it by holding down Shift, and I'm going to drag it to the left, about there, as a copy. Go OK. And then I'm going to slightly drag it back just so that it doesn't block my numbers. So now when I'm in a left view, I can actually, and it's up to you whether you have it here or here, just so that I can reference the image from a left view when it's blocked by the character like this. So we can use this one to line up our parts, and I can use this one to really see what the forms are and what the shape is. So that works really nicely, and we're just going to duplicate that process for the front view. So I'm going to select this one here, the first one we created, and this time I'm going to rotate using the Shift key. And if your angle snapper's on, that way you can rotate it nicely in 90 degrees. So hold down Shift and rotate it 90 degrees. That's it there. And then move it back a little bit. And just from a front view this time, go back into your Edit Poly, select those vertices again, and this time drag those ones out to the left and drag these ones in from the right, something like that. And you'll see now we have our front view sorted, and I can pull that across. And what we want to do is look for the gap at frame 0, look for the gap between the legs here, and try to line that up with the pelvis of our character. And just in the X, that looks pretty close to what we're looking for. I think I'm happy with that. And it's set back, so that's going to work okay. And just go to a front view again, and this time we will hold Shift and just drag to the left, and that looks pretty good. Just go okay to that. So I have my front view with my 2 pieces of reference and my left view with my 2 pieces of reference. So now I can select all of those, come up into my layer manager, and just use the create new layer from selection. Click on that, creates a new layer, and in there are my 4 planes. I'm just going to rename that to reference. And what I'm also going to do while they're selected like this, I'm going to right click, object properties, and just make sure show frozen in gray is unticked. Otherwise, if I freeze these are going to turn gray, and I'm not going to be able to see my image. So I just untick that, go okay. And so now in my layer manager, I can just freeze those, and now I can't select them. I can't accidentally select them, bump them, or move them. And I'll make sure that the tick is back at the top. Close down my layer manager, and I am now ready to animate this character. Looks like I might need to just come into my layer. You can see that flickering that's happening there. If you just go into your reference and unfreeze it, grab this guy and slightly move him forward. They're just sharing exactly the same space or 3D space. So now that I've moved it, it stops the flickering in the viewport. You can also, in your material editor, is go back to the parent level and just bring up the self-illumination a little bit, and that just stops it from going dark as you rotate around. First thing I'm going to do is create my viewports the way I want them. So I'm just going to right click up here where it says shaded. It might say wireframe for you, but this section here, right click, configure, and then go to your layout. And I'm just going to do a 2 view side by side. Just go okay. Pull this across to give us a bit more space, and you'll see that I now have 2 views when I look at the multi-view process. This one I'm going to make my front view, and this one is going to be my left view. So I'm going to work in those 2 views, and just to make it a little easier for you to see, I'm just going to go into my reference and bring my opacity down to say 50%. That's going to make it slightly transparent, make it easier for you to see what is the robot and what is not. The big red ring at the bottom, which is my character, I'm character master. I'm not going to need that for now, so I'm going to right click and I'm going to hide by selection so that I can easily from a left view select my feet controllers. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use auto key to do our work here. The way auto key works, if I'm say at frame 24 and I grab my foot controller here and move it forward, it automatically creates a keyframe at 24, but you'll notice here it also creates a keyframe at 0. What you have to be aware of is if you move something in auto key mode on any other frame other than 0, it will create both keyframes, and the first keyframe is its original position. And that's going to work fine for us. So you always start with the top of the chain, and in this instance that's our center of gravity. That is the highest thing on the chain. The only thing higher is our master character controller, which we just hid. So therefore the next one is the center of gravity, and then we go hips and then feet to work down, and then when we work up we go spine and then hands and then finally maybe the neck. But we always start with the highest thing on the chain. So what we're going to do is bring this down. We're going to use the head to line it up in the reference. Don't worry that it's forward. That's because there is neck rotation. You can see here in the reference there is neck rotation moving forward. And we're going to do that later on. But for now, just look at the pelvis here and try to get it pretty much where we need it. And notice at 24 we get a keyframe. We also get one at 0. So that's looking pretty good. Okay, now we've got that there. This process I'm about to show you, we have to consistently do this for the rest of this animation. We have to make sure that frames 0 and 24 match exactly the same as our reference. 0 and 24 match in the reference, and it's the same for our animation here. So what we do is we select the keyframe on the timeline, we hold down Shift, and we drag it to 0. And you can see now there's no difference at all between those two keyframes. I'm going to do the same thing and shift and drag that to 12. As the walk cycle goes through left and right steps, the center of gravity comes back to exactly where it was at the start at frame 12. So let's continue on a little bit. I'm going to go to frame 6 now, just halve the distance there. And you can notice in the reference that it's leaning over to the left, and we need to do that same thing. So I'm leaning it over to the left, probably about there. And it also has to come up. You can see the head height here. So let's bring it up and match it, probably about there. Looks pretty good. And let's fine tune it. What we're never going to do with this center of gravity is rotate it, and you'll notice I've locked those so you can't actually rotate it. But what's very important is that you do not move it forward or backwards. We're only moving left and right and up and down with this center of gravity. We do not sway forwards and backwards while we walk in a standard walk cycle. So just that looks pretty good. Now we'll halve this distance again. We're going to 18, and what we're doing here was pretty much the exact opposite to what we just did. And we're going to swing this one over to the right this time, probably about there. And you can see that we're getting this sort of V shape. Now if I go to 3 and halve that distance again, this is the point where the walk is at its lowest in the cycle. So I'm moving that down and just try to make sure that we're lined up in the front view as well. And I'm going to go to 9, and this is where we're at our highest in the keyframe. Don't worry too much that the feet might disconnect from the legs. We're going to fix that shortly. Just get the torso right, and in the front view that needs to come across a little bit more as well. Now we do 15, and the idea here is to just keep matching the head height and then come to the front view and make sure that we're where we need to be left to right. So the next one's 21, exactly the same as 9. It's the highest point right here, and we swing across slightly, and that's looking pretty good. I'll go slightly more. That's looking pretty good, and you can see now in the front view the pelvis matches the reference. Looks like frame 12 we're out of whack a little bit there. That looks right. And always to be sure, just select the 0 frame or the 24th and drag it to the other end using Shift. Hold Shift and drag that, and that way it always matches. Now, a nice trick to test that 0 and 24 match is you can use the greater than or less than key on your keyboard. If you go to frame 24 and then hit the greater than key, you'll be able to shuttle or jog between the first and last frame. I use that a lot through this process because you should see no variation in the viewport whatsoever. Okay, so the next thing we can do is move down to the feet and we can start posing. Now I'm going to do this at frame 24. I'm going to grab the blue foot controller and I'm going to slide it forward and I'm going to match my reference. So just coming in here now, I'm going to rotate it. What I like to do is, if I move this slightly out of the road, like drag it back here a little bit, and just get the angle the same as the foot. And I'm just switching off my angle snap, it just gives me a finer angle to work with. And we're also going to be rotating in local mode up here. It just allows the gizmo to actually show me what that angle is, which you don't get in view mode. So that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to move it forward and just try to line up that contact point with the ground. And that looks pretty good for me. And I jumped one step too far then. What I didn't do is do my hip rotation. So I'm just going to grab the hip rotator, which is the red, this red ring here. I'm going to go to a front view and I'm going to get this rotation correct. So if I go to frame 24, the way the hip rotator works, if we look at our reference, have a look at this blue section here, the light blue section. When the blue leg is forward, it's angled down and it's also angled forward, rotated forward. And then when the green leg is forward, it's the opposite. And so you can see that it rotates quite a lot from the hips, and it's a very important part of getting a good walk cycle is getting this hip rotation working. So the first thing I'm going to do is just going to switch off the auto key and I'm going to slightly rotate the hips forward a little bit. And by switching off the auto key means I'm not actually animating that, and it's actually going to maintain that curve. It's going to maintain that rotation. Switch the auto key back on, go to 24, and when the blue leg is forward, we have to rotate forward, probably about here, and we also have to rotate down like this. So we're going forward and down when the blue leg is forward. Probably not too much. That's a little bit extreme, that rotation. I'm just going to bring it back slightly. Probably about there is fine. We grab the frame 24 keyframe, hold shift and drag it back to frame 0 so that they match. Now at 12, we're going to try to get the exact opposite rotation. So I'm just going to rotate back this way, and I'm also going to rotate down this way. So we should be looking at nice balance of 0 and 12 as being opposite of one another, and then back to 24. And if we jog between the two, we shouldn't see any difference. There's a bit of difference in the leg only because we jumped to that prematurely, but you'll see that the hips are fine. Now, the hips only need 2 sets of keyframes, 0, 12, and 24. So they don't need 6s, 3s, and what we have to aim for is to try to do as few keyframes as possible. That will always give you a smoother motion. So that's looking pretty good. Okay, so now we can move to the feet, and the feet are to be animated every 3rd keyframe. So now I can actually position these feet. If you had have tried to position the feet before you did the hips, this angle of the leg would not have matched. Because the hips have a very big bearing on the location of the pivot points of these hip joints, and without the hip rotation you just simply won't get this angle here. I'm going to grab the green, move it back, and like before I like to get the angle right on the foot and then position it, which is about here, and then I'll grab the toe and rotate that up, probably about there, and then fine tune the foot just to put that foot roll on the ground. That looks pretty good. Be very careful not to lock the leg like this, because you will get very unwanted jiggle in the animation. That looks pretty good. And we can grab both feet controllers, highlight the last key, shift, and drag that to the first key. And if we jog between the two, you'll see that they match. The toes don't, so we need to do the same there for the toe that we animated. We also need to create a keyframe for this toe as well. So just going to do a little wobble and pretty much put it back to where it was. And what that does is creates the keyframes, and now I can shift and drag. Now it's very important that we have a keyframe for every third frame for these feet. Okay, now let's go ahead, and I think for this we'll move 3 keyframes at a time and just keep matching the reference. So I'm going to just go to a left view here, and every now and then I'll check the front view. So grab your foot controller, rotate it to the desired angle, which is pretty much straight, and then position it. And that looks pretty good. Grab your toe controller and once again just give it a little wiggle, or you can shift and drag that forward. And that looks okay. We'll do the same with the green guy. We'll rotate him first and then position that up here. And we need to rotate the toe slightly more. In fact, this guy needs to come up a little higher, probably about there. And then we can rotate our toe to about there. Should be fine. So I'm going to move ahead and I'm going to match the position and the rotation of the feet for the whole 24 frames using every third keyframe, and make sure that you refer to the front view just to make sure that things are working the way they should. So there you can see that I have laid in all of the poses and everything's looking good. Sometimes you have to slightly come off the model, but remember that this is a very different character that we're using as reference, which can be the case sometimes. And you have to make a best judgment. The reason why I've come off the model a little bit there is I need that foot to clear the ground as it's coming through, and that way it does actually clear the ground. The other thing to remember, if you do press play here, well, there's 2 things actually. First of all, you're not watching that in real time, so it may be a very different time or speed. But the most important thing is that the viewport in the background, our reference, takes a little bit of time, a fraction of a second, to catch up to the play in the character. So when you press play, it does often look like it's a long way off the reference. It doesn't quite match the reference. And most of the time, as soon as you hit pause, everything looks the way it should. It's because there's a little bit of lag there. So be careful of that. I'm just going to go to a front view now and just do a quick check. Everything looks okay from a front view. What I'm going to do is just switch off the auto key, and I'm going to slightly rotate, but this time I'm not going to use local, I'm just going to use the view, because what I want to do is universally just slightly rotate the feet out a little bit. You'll see that now as he walks, there's a little bit of movement there, a little bit of angle to the foot, and that just makes it a little bit more realistic. I'm going to do the same with the left foot as well. Slightly rotate it out, and that's looking pretty good. And what I might also do is just bring my knee pointers out slightly as well, just so that they're slightly outside the leg, and that way as the character walks we're getting some nice movement. And probably one last thing, I'm just going to go to my auto key, and the 2 frames where the foot is in the air, which is for this one is frame, for the blue foot, it's frame 18 and 21. So I'm just going to slightly move it out, and then at 21 I'm going to make it a little bit further out, and that way it's just going to sort of rotate around a little bit and clear the other foot. That's fairly common for a walk cycle. So same too, it's 6 and 9 for the green foot. I'm just going to slightly move that one out, and then 9, probably a little bit more, and that way it's just going to sort of swing around as it goes through that passing animation phase. And as you may have guessed, we have to do the torso before we do the hands, and it's very important that we get the torso right first, otherwise many of the poses for the hands and the arms won't match our reference. So what we need to do is we need to, you can see in the reference, the torso at frame 0 bends to the left and then swings back so that the neck actually lines up with the torso, with the pelvis here. And then when we get to 12, it's the opposite. So we need to do the same with our torso as well. The other thing to be aware of is this character in our reference actually has clavicle bones or clavicle controllers, which allow you to lift, raise, and rotate the shoulder joints or clavicle joints independent of the actual arm itself. And therefore we have to, because our character does not have these things, because it's a robot, we have to sort of put a little bit of extra twist in the upper torso control, which is this one here, to compensate for it. And you'll see what I mean shortly. So I'm going to go to frame 24. I'm going to grab my first torso here, and I'm going to rotate it to the left. Just try to line it up with that purple joint there. Then I'm going to grab my other torso, and I'm going to bring it back and try to keep it nicely lined up in the center. You can see the head at the top there. We can sort of get a rough idea of where it should be, probably about there. And let's go back to our local mode so we can see our rotation here. I'm going to go to a left view, and I'm going to try to get this sort of, notice how far back the arm is here. So I'm going to try to do something similar by rotating our character back to about here. And that's looking pretty good. Let's go back to our front view. I think that's going to work okay. And we need to also rotate our head forward. That's cool. So go ahead and grab all three of those controllers and shift and drag from 24 to 0. And now we're going to go to frame 12, and we're going to go back the exact opposite way. So start with this one, and we go back to the left, or the character's left. We take this one, and it's easier to straighten it up first, then get the angle right, which is probably about here, about there, and then give it the twist that it needs. And just line it up from a left view. And that's looking pretty good. So if we look from a top view, we can see those shoulders are moving backwards and forwards. That's looking pretty good. Go back to our front view, and we should be able to see a nice torso curve happening. And now we just need to bring our head back to the forward position. And that's working very nicely. Everything looks good. So we can move on to the hands now. And grab our blue hand controller. I'm going to work in the front view just to position them first. Just click and drag and bring it down and just line it up. And because we're finished with our knee controllers for now, I'm just going to grab these two and hide them. If we need them, we can bring them back in our layer manager. That just allows me to see what I'm doing. So I'm just trying to line the pivot point up here with the pivot point of the wrist here. We may need to go a little bit longer because the joints are slightly different proportions. That looks pretty good. Now it's nowhere near where it needs to be, and I'll show you why in a minute. It's because we're pulling these straight in from the side and they need to be moved forward. But I'm just doing this in a front view. It makes it a little bit easier. In fact, I'll go back to my two views so we can see what is happening. I'll make this one here is my left view. And you can see that now that they line up in the front view, all I need to do is move them back in the left view. So as I said, this one could probably come down a little bit and back. We're trying to match the arm angle more than anything. And now I'm going to rotate it as well. Just rotate it, try to match the reference. That looks pretty good. And you can probably come in slightly. And then I grab my elbow pointer and slide it in just to match the reference in the front view. Do the same with this one. I'm just going to rotate this into position and move it into position. Just rotate it up. When the hand comes forward, it likes to roll over slightly. So don't forget to do that. Don't worry about the fingers for now. We're going to get to those later. And it looks like we could probably come forward a little bit just on the reference. Just line it up like that. And just get your elbow pointers right. Looks like they need to come in slightly, probably about there. So let's grab all of those now, including the two elbow pointers, and click, shift and drag, and then we'll just jog between 0 and 24, and so far the whole character is matching nicely. So I'll do one more pose. We'll go to frame 3 now. I'm just going to move this down. About there. Now it's important at frame 3 that we get this hand to rotate past the arm line. Notice here it's lined up with the arm line. And we just need to bring that in slightly like this. And then 3 frames later it goes back, and it's like the fingers are getting left behind by the animation, and that's exactly the way it should be. We've got a little bit of a gimbal problem there, but I'm going to show you how to fix that or correct that shortly. Looks to me like this arm needs to come down and back. Now I know that we're a long way off the reference here, but it's those clavicles in the shoulders that are giving us a little bit of problem, and it looks like the head needs to come up slightly on this pose. So I'm just going to bring that up a little bit, probably about there. Just making sure that I'm not going to destroy anything in the legs. That's probably okay. And frame 0, what I like to do is just line it up with the forearm like this, and then 3 frames later you can see that it leaves the fingers behind, and then as it moves forward it gives weight to the fingers. So I'll do the green hand as well. So frame 0 it lines up, 3 frames later it leaves the fingers behind slightly. That's pretty good. And then obviously frame 3 we can come back and bring those fingers down a little bit. It looks pretty good. So I'm going to go through now and line up all the rest of the poses, and the hands only need to be posed every 3rd frame, and the spine joints and the head was only 0, 12 and 24. And of course keep an eye on your elbow helpers. They'll probably need to be posed every 6 frames, I believe. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so I've finished laying in the arms, and as you can see some of the poses are a little bit different to the reference, but only because of the proportions of the actual character. As long as we stay relatively in the same space and the same timing as the reference, then you're generally going to get something that works quite well. Pay careful attention to the rotation of the wrists, and they slightly rotate over at the front and they slightly rotate under at the back. And be careful not to animate them too much, because remember there are only 3 frames between each pose. If you have really extreme changes between 3 frames, then played back at real-time speed, you tend to get a popping or a very unnatural movement, because that's 3/24ths of a second, sorry. So we're looking pretty good, and everything looks okay. Now it's time to do a little bit of polish. So the first thing I like to do is switch off the auto key. I'm just going to go into a bit of a front view. In fact, what I'll do is just hide my reference to make life a little bit easier. Just go into a little bit of a perspective mode, or go to a front view and then use your Alt middle mouse button to rotate around a little bit. And I'm going to go to a pose where the hands are sort of facing the ground. So there's a good one there. So around about frame 12 should be fine. And what I'm going to do is pose these fingers. I'm doing this with auto key off. Now it's very important that you don't put any animation on the fingers. They are literally just dangling off the hands. There's no muscular process going on during a walk cycle. So what I like to do is double click on the base finger, and then that selects all of the children of that parent there. And if I rotate that, you get this nice curved movement. But if you don't get this, it's because you're not in local mode for starters. And notice just next to these modes there's 3 different types of pivot point rotation or movement. If you're in, say, this one here and you try to rotate it, this is what you'll get, and that's not what you want. You want the top one here, which is use pivot point center, and you want it in local mode, and that way you're going to get this nice organic movement. Now what I like to do is just rotate it a little bit, grab the base knuckle and just drag it back slightly until it sort of lines up straight. Then I grab the second set of knuckles or second finger and I'll rotate that a little bit further. The third, even further still, and the fourth, probably the most. Something like that looks fine. And just use your own fingers as reference. Just dangle them down and look at them and try to match them. Now the thumbs are important to get right. Things will generally not look right if the thumbs aren't right. So if you use your own hand as reference, you'll see that the thumb actually points down to the ground. And then these other joints just sort of bend slightly like so. And you can see that that's a very nice, natural looking hand pose. And if we look at it in a front view, have a look at the difference that it makes to get the fingers right. Have a look at that left hand as far as a believable pose, and then look at the right hand. The right hand looks like a soldier marching sort of thing, and even then the thumbs aren't right. But it also allows us to see that we do have a little bit of a problem. If we play this back, we do have a bit of a problem with the rotation of that hand, and it's feeling very sort of tucked under. So now that we've got the fingers right, we can make sure that we get these poses correctly. That one's probably a little bit too tucked under there. Straighten that one up a little bit more. And this one is a major one that needed to be fixed. So if we just play that back. Now you'll notice that we're getting some wiggle in its in between keyframes, and this is what's called gimbal lock. I'm not going to cover it in too much detail here, but you can see that there's a lot of rotation movement in that joint, and I'm not doing it. It's happening because of the 3 axes of rotation causes a gimbal lock problem. So what I'm going to do is open up my curve editor. Just going to slide this over here and give us a little bit of room so we can see what's going on. And if I click these two just to frame them up and just select the rotation, you can see that there's a really quite a big lift here. If I pull these down a little bit, what we can actually do, and it looks like these could be a bit of an issue as well. Just pull these up slightly. What we do is we just grab the keyframes and we slightly adjust them in the curve editor to get rid of that unwanted rotation, and that looks a lot better. Looks like this one here could probably just straighten over a little bit. And that's looking pretty good. Okay, so we've cleaned that one up. Let's have a quick, just a viewport play. And you can see the difference between the two hands. So I'm going to go ahead and just do the other fingers now. Okay, so there's both fingers done now. And if we have a look at that, it's brought a lot more believability to the walk cycle. We'll look at that from, say, a left view. It definitely feels a lot more organic. So let's go ahead and polish the animation a little bit. Let's have a look at, it looks to me like the head is a little bit tilted up. So let's go ahead and see if we can maybe tilt it forward slightly. Do the same on this keyframe. Make sure you shift and drag. In fact, now's a good time to jog between the 0 and 24, just using the greater than and less than button. And it looks like we've got a mismatch definitely with these. Hold down, shift and drag 0 to 24. And it looks like we've got, probably don't require these keyframes on 3. And that looks okay. So once again, just do a little bit of a jog. And it looks pretty good. Back to a front view. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just check the trajectories on some of these objects, and I'm just going to do the hands first and just show you how to do this. If we click on the hand controller, we can either go up, switch off the auto key, we can either go up to the display here and roll down until we get the display properties, and we can tick the trajectory button. And what that actually does is it shows us an actual trajectory path of that object through space. So if we look at that as a wireframe, you can see how that works. And what we're trying to do is get a nice smooth arc without any straight lines. Now this little little one here is unavoidable because it's a 3-frame interval in between those two, but you should definitely see a drop. You should see it drop down and then come forward, and that's exactly the way a walk cycle actually looks. So that one's looking pretty good. We can grab the other one now, switch on the trajectory for it, and they should pretty much match. There shouldn't be much of a discrepancy, and as you can tell, it's not too bad. It looks like when we get up to here, it doesn't quite match the other pose. I'm just going to switch on auto key and come to that exact point, which is this frame 15. I'm just going to move it down and try to get it to match that other frame, and maybe frame 12 it could probably go forward a little bit and then slightly up. That way we're going to get the same sort of kick forward as the other one. And then maybe when we come back to here, this can probably come down and then back slightly, just to match the other one. And that's looking pretty good. I think that one's okay. If anything, I would grab the green one, go to that frame 12, and then slightly bring it back. And that's working pretty well. And maybe frame 15, just bring it back slightly, maybe slightly up. Okay, so that's working pretty well. I can go to my foot controller as well, switch on the trajectory, and you should see something that pretty much looks like this, with a nice curve as it lifts up and moves forward. Everything works pretty well there. I can go to a front view, just switch on my center of gravity, switch on the trajectory, and we should get this sort of butterfly looking scenario. And if we look at that one, 0 and 12 should sit exactly at the same height, and they are, and it looks pretty good. This should be uniform, and that's exactly what we're getting there. So I'm going to switch off my trajectories now. In fact, an easy way to get them all off is just to select everything and switch off trajectories. Okay, so we're looking pretty good. Now I just want to do a test render just to see what this guy looks like, and to do that I'm just going to create a box for him to walk on, so that I can see that there's no foot penetration through the ground, that sort of stuff. That looks pretty good there. Just hit P for perspective, and just make sure that it's all contained in the view. Just gonna right click, and where is it? Perspective here, right click, show save frame. That looks pretty good. That's all contained. So now I can just go Tools, Views, grab Viewport, Create Animation Sequence, and it'll pop up with this. We don't need bones and particle objects, we just need geometry. I'll make this 100%, and which is 640/80, and realistic is fine, perspective is fine, and if we just go create, what will actually happen is it will do a low quality render, and it will automatically open up my viewer, which is here. This is my Windows. It'll open up whatever video viewer you have installed as the standard on your system, and you can see there that our walk cycle is looking pretty good, and we don't have any major problems with it, and I think it's certainly good enough for us to go on to the next step now, which is to animate it out over 10 seconds. So it's actually quite simple to animate this guy over 10 seconds. I'm just going to switch off that safe frame again. The first thing we need to do to get this guy to animate over 10 seconds is we need to repeat our 24 frame cycle. Now there's a very easy way to do that in Max, and it's called out of range types. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of our animated items here. So if I just bring up my layer manager, go into my rig objects, I should be able to select absolutely everything in the rig, and I'll unhide anything that's hidden. And the only thing I don't need to select is the character master. We're going to get to that shortly. And then just click this button here, which is select highlighted. And so what you'll see now is I've got everything that I animated in the cycle. I'm going to bring up my curve editor, which is going to look very busy, as you can see. But I can highlight all of the key frames in the whole character, go into edit, controller out of range types. And by default, the range types of the keyframes is set to constant, which means once an animation reaches a specific pose or something like that, it stays in that pose position and it goes out to infinity in a constant direction. What I want to do is change this to relative repeat, which will loop the animation, but it will loop it based on where it was when it finished the last loop. And you can see by the little diagram what that basically means. And so if I go OK, what we should get is this, where our 24 frame animation is just repeated over and over and over again. And that's exactly what we want. By using relative repeat, it literally takes the 24 frame loop, it dumps the 0 frame on top of the 24th frame, and then it dumps the 0 frame on top of the 48th frame, and that way we don't get that little pause that we see in the reference. 0 becomes 24 instead of going slightly after it, and it works perfectly. So I'm now just going to go into my time configuration down here, and I'm going to type in a 0 into length and go OK. So now I've got 240 frames on my timeline, and basically if I press play, it should animate for 240 frames, and it should work perfectly. Now, to really test that, I can go to frame 240 and use the same rock using greater than less than. I can rock between 240 and 0 and nothing should change, and that's perfect. So the only thing left to do now is to grab our master character controller, and if that's hidden for you, we did hide it earlier, just go into your rig options and make sure it's unhidden. So all we need to do is, I'm just going to go to a little bit of a wider view, switch on auto key, go to frame 240, grab that master character controller and drag it forward. Now, it doesn't really matter how far because we're going to fine tune it shortly, but notice what will happen if I go to a left view. He will take a bit of time to get up to speed, and then he gets faster and faster and faster. Now, the reason for that is down here we have a default keyframe type, and it is set to smooth, which means if I look at this in a curve editor, it's a curve, which means it slowly starts to get fast and then it slowly goes to a stop, and we don't want that. What we want is linear. We want linear motion. So grab all of the keyframes, and this is the master character controller I've got selected here. Grab all the keyframes and click on the linear tangent button. That makes it completely linear, and now you'll see that he will be at the same speed all the way through the animation. So now we've just got to line up and make sure that the feet aren't sliding, and at the moment they're definitely sliding. There's a lot of on the spot moving, similar to a bit of a forward moonwalk, so to speak. And the easiest way to line this up is to create a dummy box. So I'm just going to slide in here. I'm going to create a box lined up right with the heel of the character. So all that is a box. Let's go to a left view here and show you what I've done. Just line that up with the heel of the character, and we're working in the left view. Grab your master, your character master, open up the curve editor, and just have this over here. Scale this up a little bit, make sure it all fits. And what I'm going to do is basically bring my animation to frame 6. Now that allows me to grab this keyframe here, which is the final position of the master, and drag it either up and down to change the value of it. If I drag it this way, it moves backwards. If I drag it this way, it moves forwards. Keep dragging it until that heel lines up. And now the position should be fine to minimize the foot slide. Now that we've got the position, we'll just have a look at that and how it works. And sometimes it pays to just put a checkerboard material on the ground. So I'll just make that visible, and I'll make it a few more checks. That looks good. And that way we can really make a good assessment on foot slide. So let's have a little bit of a play in the viewport. Timing isn't so, the speed of the playback isn't as important as the foot slide that might be happening. And we're getting pretty close there. A little bit of slide, and we're going to minimize that now. So just go to the left view and select the blue foot controller, bring up your auto key, and remember we can amend this as we go, but what we don't want to do is forget about the 0 and 24 have to match. So that one looks pretty good. I'm going to go to frame 3 now, and it looks like this can come back slightly. Frame 6, of course, we know lines up. Frame 9 definitely needs to come forward a little bit. Probably about there should be fine. And frame 12 looks like it's a long way back, long way forward. So it's looking pretty good. 15 could probably come forward a little bit. And that's working okay. So now let's go ahead and do the green one. And we have to wait until the green one is actually planted on the ground, which is at frame 12. Grab your reference box. Notice I'm switching off auto key so I can move this reference box and it won't animate. I'm just lining it up with the back of the heel. Grab the foot controls again. Make sure we've got them. Switch on your auto key. Go to frame 15. Looks like it can come back slightly. Frame 18. Slightly forward. 21. It's looking pretty good. And frame 24 can definitely come forward as well. Probably about there should do it. And then just don't forget to shift and drag 24 back to 0. Okay, so let's have a look at our walk cycle now. I'll go to a perspective view, come back and just see if we can sort of frame up our character here. And I might just hide some of these rig objects so we can really assess what's going on. So he's looking pretty good as far as foot slide goes. There's a minimal amount of foot slide there, but because he is a non-humanoid character, we can be forgiven a little bit. And of course your ground plane is probably not going to be as high detailed and contrast as this checkerboard. So we'll just come back slightly. And all up, he's looking pretty good. It's a nice walk cycle as far as matching our reference. I probably have accentuated the curve of the spine a little bit too much for this character. He's definitely walking very humanoid, and that's to be expected, I guess, given the reference that we used. But generally, he's pretty good. So, just in covering the basics here, the first step, always make sure you prepare your reference so that it's nice and usable, and you're going to be able to bring it into 3D Max, and it's going to have all of the elements you need. The second step is to make sure you set up the scene. You've got to make sure that your time is correct. Be very cautious about the frame rate of how you work, because if you don't set the frame rate correctly, later on you will not be able to just simply convert. All the keyframes won't perfectly sit on keys and or sit on frames, and you definitely cannot repair that damage. So always make sure you set your file up first. Go to the next step, which is blocking in the animation. Just lock it in hard and fast in lieu of doing a polish pass. And that, of course, is the next step where we go in and we fine-tune and polish the animation. We get the fingers right, we look at the trajectories, and we really try to smooth out the animation. You can also go into the curve editor and make sure that your keys are the right smoothness, whether they're slow in, slow out, those types of things. We got away with just auto keys or auto tangents on our keyframes. And then the last step we saw today was the looping out of animation just by using the out of range types controllers. And then we were able to fine tune the animation to make sure that the foot slide was fine. So there's our walk cycle animation. He's working pretty well. Give that a try. I'm sure you'll be rewarded in the process. It's a great thing to try for somebody starting out in 3D Studio Max, especially if you had the opportunity to rig this character. And as I said before, an FK or an IK rig, you're going to be able to match this process with no problems whatsoever. So I hope you